Welcome to the Forged by Trust podcast. I'm your host, Robin Dreeke, former U.S. Marine, spy recruiter, and trust expert. This episode of the Forged by Trust podcast is brought to you by my guest today, Ken Dekleva, and his recently released novel, The Negotiators Cross. According to Paul Vidich, best-selling author of The Mercenary, The Matchmaker, The Coldest Warrior, and An Honorable Man, The Negotiators Cross is the magical story of Father Ishmael, a priest with a dark past who finds himself on a journey where his faith and faithlessness are tested by gangsters and spies in Russia and Mexico. The story speaks to the emotional wisdom of listening to one's heart while moving through a dangerous and uncertain world. Adventure, intrigue, and betrayal play out on a broad canvas in this elegantly written debut novel. Coming up next on the Forged by Trust podcast.
The Russian ambassador to the UK, stationed in London, has decades of experience. But what I found most interesting about the interview were several things. So language can be used to create trust and intimacy, to borrow the words from your show. You have to like people. You have to be curious about people. You have to be able to be comfortable with ambiguity, with silence. You have to learn to listen better. These cultural experiences that I've had where you find common ground with people, you find common humanity with people. And I think that's very important for interviewers to have.
Welcome to the show. I'm Robin Dreeke, and on the Forged by Trust podcast, we decode the interpersonal communication skills of the world's most acclaimed forgers of trust. We unlock the skills and techniques from spies, spy recruiters, master interrogators, globally recognized behavioral experts, C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, acclaimed authors, and thought leaders. Each episode provides specific actions that you can immediately apply to any aspect of your personal or professional life. Today's episode, Nothing Human is Alien, a master interviewer's framework, is with my good friend, the inspirational Dr. Ken Dekleva. Dr. Ken Dekleva is a practicing psychiatrist and currently a senior fellow at the George H.W. Bush for U.S.-China Relations and a former regional medical officer, psychiatrist, and senior physician-diplomat with the US Dept of State, including 5 years in Moscow. During this episode today, we talk about analyzing the body language of the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom's BBC interview, his interviewing expertise after thousands of clinical interviews, what makes a great interviewer, curiosity as a way of life, the power of observation, you can't heal everyone, finding a balance by maintaining healthy relationships for self-care, nothing human is alien, and how to inspire someone to share their truth. Hey, Ken. I actually recognize that shirt. Is that a Marine security guard shirt from an embassy?
Yes, I collected those when I traveled. This is from the US Vienna where I served.
I collected them too. You know, being a former Marine, I love those shirts.
They're very. Marines... This one is they're nice cotton, and I use them casually. I use them to work out in. So I have like 7 or 8 of them from all over the world.
Awesome.
One from Havana.
Oh, that's nice.
I have a Moscow one, which has an insignia. It has the Marine insignia, and then it has St. Basil's Cathedral in it, which is kind of cool.
You know, when I'm having folks like you on, I can never, ever try to do one-upsmanship. I'll lose every time.
No, I gave that shirt as a birthday present to my Sistema teacher in Moscow. That's Russian martial art that I've studied for many years. He's a former GRU Spetsnaz colonel who was decorated by Putin and Chaika and people like that for valor. And he wore that shirt once in a seminar. So I thought that was kind of neat that he would wear an embassy shirt. I guess he was very proud of the connection.
Oh, the people you were around were people I'd been trying to recruit my entire life. Awesome. So anyway, Ken, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I have our agenda that we chatted beforehand, and you are like one of these individuals that you just don't know where to start because there's so many great things. But I want to do something a little different this time on this particular episode, if you don't mind, because you sent me something a couple of days ago. And what I'll do is for everyone listening in, I'll put the episode in the show links, the YouTube video you sent me of the great BBC interview of the Russian ambassador to the UK. And you asked me some interesting questions that you floated around there about. So the Russian ambassador to the UK provided an interview and it had a lot of interesting aspects of it. He came across as very Russian to me, having heard him a bunch of times, but you brought up some interesting themes about what you saw. So I want to chat about that a little bit because I just thought it was interesting as a good primer. And so for those of you all listening, go to the show notes. I'm going to include a link to the YouTube video of the Russian ambassador to the UK being interviewed by a BBC interviewer. And it was really intriguing because there's a lot of behavioral things going on there.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I think that's a fascinating interview, and I think for your listeners and viewers, some context is important.
Yep.
The Russian ambassador to the UK stationed in London is, as it would be for our country as well, one of the top 2 or 3 diplomatic postings in the world. And that's a posting that will only go to a very, very senior person with vast diplomatic experience. So this particular ambassador is no stranger to diplomacy. He has decades of experience. But what I found most interesting about the interview were several things. One is the fact that it happened. The other is the fact that it was in English rather than in Russian. Even though the ambassador speaks English well, you could tell during the interview that his English was, because he was nervous, it was forced and strained. It didn't have the likely natural flow of English that you would expect in a casual conversation with a Russian diplomat with an excellent knowledge of English. So that struck me, why they would do the interview in English and why he would agree to it rather than his native language where he would be more comfortable. I also thought, in terms of context, the BBC's hard talk style of interview here was probably less productive in getting the ambassador to be more comfortable and to open up and to sort of try to gauge his emotions, his feelings, as well as his views on the war. And I think it probably had the effect of boxing him into a harder line. That being said, he couldn't hide his body language, which I saw as a mixture of nervousness, fear, and even other emotions such as disappointment and maybe sadness. His eyes often looked away during the interview, which I found striking, and there was he had a facial tic at times, again suggesting the extreme stress of this particular interview. So I found those kind of behavioral clues very interesting, as well as the content of the interview.
Now, Ken, I obviously did an intro to you and your background before we started this, but just a little bit of where you came from and your expertise in this area, and then I want to dive into some of these observations you had.
Sure. For your listeners, I'm a psychiatrist. I practice in Texas, and I trained here in Texas, in Dallas, at UT Southwestern Medical School, where I went to medical school, did adult psychiatry residency training, and then taught for several years in the 90s as a junior faculty member at the university, working in a variety of emergency room and forensic settings. By forensic settings, I mean jails. I worked for several years in a large county jail, in a conditional release prison clinic, and served as an expert witness in a large number of criminal trials with charges ranging from robbery, aggravated assault, child sexual assault, murder, kidnapping, and capital murder, where I really had to learn in those settings to sharpen my interview skills and my listening skills with some of the most challenging interview subjects that I've encountered. After that, in 2002, I joined the US Department of State, where I served for the next 14 years as a regional psychiatrist and physician-diplomat, mostly overseas, including 5 years in Russia, 2 years in Mexico City, 2 years in New Delhi, and 3 years in Europe, as well as in a leadership role in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. The jobs, we're part of a larger medical program, and the jobs involve, in addition to busy work at our home posting, usually a large embassy like Moscow or Mexico, also extensive regional travel throughout the world.
It's just dumbfounding. But how many languages do you speak?
I think I can get by in about 4 or 5. I speak Russian, Spanish, Serbian, or Bosnian. They're really the same, but they're now considered separate languages, and some French and some German. But languages are a perishable skill. If you don't use them all the
Sure.
time, you lose them. So the ones that probably stick to my brain the best are Spanish right now, living in Texas, Russian, and Serbian, which I learned when I was in college. And I lived in the former Yugoslavia in Belgrade.
Also, I feel like an attorney setting you up as my expert witness before we dive in. I apologize for that. And so, if you're to estimate, if you can even do so, because I know you've conducted so much, but how many interviews do you think you've actually done where you're doing it as a clinician?
As a clinician, thousands, because I'm a practicing clinician 4 days a week and throughout a 30-year career, thousands of interviews as a clinician, which is a clinical setting, an emergency room or a jail or an outpatient clinic where you spend an hour with someone to try to understand initially their diagnosis, what ails them, and how you can best help them. In terms of forensic interviews where I evaluated criminal defendants, either for the district attorney, the court, or the defense attorney, or the federal US Attorney's Office, or the federal public defender's office. I've done probably maybe 100 to 200 such forensic evaluations during that time when I was doing that work.
So just a little bit. Okay. Okay. So thank you, Ken. Thanks for rehashing that for me, because your observations are just so amazing when looking at this video. And you're right. I was shocked that the ambassador would put himself up to this. Why do you think that was? Because this was, as you framed, it was kind of adversarial in a sense that I thought the interviewer was kind of really going at him and boxing him in. And you're right. I didn't think about it at the time, but when you pointed it out, he spoke in English rather than in Russian. Any thoughts as to why he allowed himself to do this?
I think a combination of probably fear, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think he's sending other messages as well. I think that there's a part of him that has to be, given his vast experience, even though he's talking the party line during the interview. Interviewers such as yourself are trained to look at the body language, what's between the lines, not merely the content.
Mm-hmm.
And even some of the content was telling. For example, when he spoke of the Russian diplomat in Geneva who quit his post and wrote an op-ed and is probably defected, Bondarev, he didn't call him a traitor. He said things to the effect of, well, we know this person, he's not all that reliable, but he didn't come out and slam him and say he's a traitor or use harsher language in describing him. That's pretty telling, because that's the party line, is that he's a traitor, and that is probably how President Putin of Russia views him, as well as his senior colleagues in the FSB. So I found that telling. The other thing about language is that when you're interviewing someone, you can use language as a tool to shift from a more formal way to intimacy. We do this every day when we use in French, for example, or you shift from, lovers will shift from vous to tu, and that's a sign of their intimacy. Or in Spanish, when someone becomes your friend, they say vamos a tutearnos, which means let's use the tu form. Same in other languages like Russian, so they can shift from the formal to the informal. I had this experience once interviewing a forensic evaluee for a defense attorney in Texas, where the evaluee was a young woman charged with very serious crime of smuggling. And this person had no prior criminal record, but because she got caught up in something bigger than herself, the motivation wasn't clear. And the attorney who hired me was a Mexican-American and a pure bilingual, and said, I can't get to her. Help me understand my client so that I can frame a proper defense of mitigation at sentencing, since the defendant had pled guilty to this one-time offense. And I spent 5 hours with the defendant, and I had a lot of trouble. The defendant was a bilingual, but when I shifted from English to Spanish and used the tu form, then she confessed, sobbing for 30 minutes, confessed, weeping, telling me her story of how this tragic crime in her case came to be. And once that was done, we shifted back to English. and wrapped up the interview. So language can be used to create trust and intimacy, to borrow the words from your show.
Right. Yeah, there is no doubt. What do you think? Gosh, trying to decide which way to go, because it is a really fascinating interview, and you brought up aspects of it that I hadn't considered on my first run through on it. You know, obviously, and I saw it too. He was definitely under stress and duress. And when you're trying to assess what was the purpose of it, when he kind of knew what it was going to be about, I wonder what his purpose of it was, really, because he didn't give anything but the party line. And so I didn't see any signs of dropping a hint, hey, you know, recruit me, or hey, I want to cooperate with the West, because he was speaking the party line, the typical Russian denial that it was all just propaganda. The videos aren't real. I mean, listening to him, I feel like I was going back a number of years, because he was speaking the exact party line. But you're right. There was such stress and nonverbal uncomfortableness going on with him.
I think so too. And I think that on an unconscious level, interview subjects cannot control their unconscious reactions. And that's what people in your previous life as an FBI special agent, or intelligence officers meeting with their case officers, meeting with their subjects, or forensic psychiatrists evaluating a defendant, we're all trained to pick up on these various signals on body language. In addition to the words, you use silence a lot during interviews. And I think the Russian ambassador at some level is saying he's not comfortable with this tragic war in the Ukraine. And that creates an opening for the right people to have further conversations with him in a different setting, and with a trusting approach, like a conversation over tea and biscuits, and in the right setting, and finding subtle ways to reach out to him. And not only him, but others like him. My guess is he's not the only senior diplomat in Europe or senior SVR, chief of station, that's the Russian Foreign Intelligence Spy Service, who probably has ambivalence. And ambivalence is something that interviewers exploit.
Yeah. And I think it's just a great example. And I appreciate you taking some time at the forefront of this chat together, because I think it gives those that are listening and have the ability to watch a great example of what the nonverbals of stress look like, because he was nonverbally stressed. Now, the great challenge of great interviewers is what's causing the stress, what's causing the uncomfortableness. And that's what only further explanation, like you said, good, trusting conversations can bring out, which is a great segue into your area of expertise, which is interviewing. Ken, what makes a great interview? I know you hit on some of these things already, but can you dive into a little bit more of what makes you and I'll call you an expert, wonderful, great interviewer?
That's very kind of you, but I learned from giants. I stand on the shoulders of many great giants who I've learned from.
Don't we all?
And I have colleagues that I've worked with both in the forensic and clinical setting that are extremely exquisitely talented interviewers, and they have a natural liking. They like people. You have to like people. You have to be curious about people. You have to be able to be comfortable with ambiguity, with silence. You have to learn to listen better. What helped me in my listening skills was living overseas. Granted, I had training as a psychiatry resident, excellent training and interviewing, but it really took a long time to develop. And my listening skills probably sharpened living overseas, because when you don't know the language offhand and you're learning, you don't understand everything going on around you, which is very discomforting. If you're the only kind in a room and you're in a room with a bunch of Russians, and yeah, I speak Russian, but everything's going so fast, or Spanish, you have to, your observational and listening skills get sharpened. So that probably had a spillover effect when I work with subsequently to my diplomatic career. So I think good listening skills, which are not easy, are very important. Likability and a curiosity in interview subjects, whether they're patients or forensic interviewees, or someone like you interviewing a potential person who you're trying to recruit, or a CIA case officer, or a lawyer talking to a client. Our brains are hardwired to pick up on nonverbals and body language. People decide when they meet me in any interviewing setting, whether it was a diplomatic subject I interviewed or a forensic subject or a patient, they decide in about 10 to 15 seconds whether they can trust you. That's all pre-verbal and at a kind of pre-conscious level of your brain. We're hardwired for those things. So I think that those are important starting points for people. And it's hard to teach those skills. I think some people just have them. We can enhance them, but it's hard to teach them. It's sort of like a musician. You can teach someone to play Eine kleine Nachtmusik, but very few people will be able to play the Rachmaninoff piano concerto, even if they have all the lessons in the world. You have to have the skill set to start, and then you build on that.
Right. And I am bent and determined to teach as much as we can of these skill sets because they're so important to forging trust, which begets the relationships that we need in life, those good, healthy relationships. And you hit on a topic right there, which is very subjective and very challenging for people. And we all are looking for because we're genetically coded for, and that's likability. Like when I'm sitting here just watching you, within first seconds, because Kevin, this is our second or third time we're chatting, you are likable. There's things you're doing with your verbals, your nonverbals, your tenor, your intonation, all these things, you're likable. What do you think makes you likable?
I don't know. I don't know, because it's harder to know ourselves than it is for others to see.
Which requires self-awareness. And I hate to interrupt, I'm so sorry, but which requires a higher level of self-awareness, because that's kind of like part two of this. Does likability require self-awareness, not self-awareness? How does this all mesh together?
It helps to have self-awareness, but again, part of it is just how we conduct ourselves. I'll tell your listeners a story. I've lived in many foreign cultures and traveled where I was the only white person in a large crowd. In Africa, I was on a business trip to West Africa and Dakar for 3 days. I had some meetings at the embassy, and I had free time in the afternoon after the meetings. And I think it was summer, so it was hot, and the sun didn't set till about 9. So I walked around downtown. I'm a white guy wearing a suit, carrying my leather satchel that's traveled 1.5 million miles with me. And I speak enough French. I had practiced my French because Senegal is a French-speaking country. And I wanted to look around and go into stores. So I talked to people. And the threat report from the embassy said, you shouldn't go downtown, it's too dangerous. But I didn't feel fear. I was curious. I walked. And I saw someone, an elderly gentleman, and I spoke to him in French, said, do you know where I can buy some clothing, some shirts? I wanted to get a present for an African-American friend, the so-called Madiba shirt that Nelson Mandela wore, a dashiki, they used to call it. And he said, oh, come with me. And he took me to the store in the factory, introduced me to the owner. He was an elderly guy, a gentleman with his family. They invited me. They gave me a tour of the store. I bought a few shirts. Then they invited me for dinner and tea. And the next morning, I had a briefing with the regional security officer, and I told him that story. He goes, oh my God, you're not supposed to go there. You could have been kidnapped and all that. And that may be true. There are some threats in many countries that I've traveled to, but something told me that it was okay and comfortable. And obviously, these people were curious about me and that I spoke a language and showed an interest in their culture.
I think one aspect of it that I pick up on when watching and listening to you, you have this amazing ability of balancing, because I see life as a balance of dichotomies in everything we do. And you have this great dichotomy and balance of confidence because of your background. I mean, you have amazing skills because of your experiences, your hard work, and your diligence, but you also have a great amount of humility, which is that curiosity. I think you can't have curiosity without humility to be curious about people. And so it sounds like that was in balance. Now, if that's true, am I right with my assessment? I'm also curious about, you have to maintain safety, and safety requires, again, an ability to observe, not just see the world around you, but to observe the world around you, interpret it for safety. Do you see all those things in yourself?
Yes, as a diplomat, I had lots of training in safety and situational awareness, and living in places like Mexico City and traveling throughout Mexico and Russia and South Asia and going to war zones, my situational awareness was always heightened. But there's a balance there where it has to be heightened enough that you're aware of what's going on around you, but not so heightened that you shut down and don't want to explore the environment. That's not an easy balance to have. And I was in Bangladesh once. I was working in Dhaka, and I forgot that Friday is a Muslim day of prayer, so I had the day off until my flight in the afternoon. So I walked around parts of old Dhaka by myself. Again, I didn't see a single European or American white person, nobody. And I went to chicken markets and bird markets, walked around, and a crowd of a couple hundred people started following me. And I was wearing jeans and a black shirt and a hat, and I had my bag and camera. And they surrounded me and they started talking. I don't speak Bengali. And they said, "Kan, American?" I said, "Yes, salam alaikum." And they smiled and said, "Wa salam alaikum." Salam alaikum is a greeting in the Muslim world. So it's the only word that I knew that could connect with these people. And then they started coming up to me and talking to me, and some in very broken English. And then a police officer showed up with a rattan cane and ran them off. But it was, again, these cultural experiences that I've had where you find common ground with people, you find common humanity with people. And I think that's very important for interviewers to have.
Which it's a beautiful segue. Thank you for reading my mind, Ken. You become this human being that has these amazing interpersonal skills and human skills, and we'll get into that, but they come from somewhere. So what was your background? Is this what you always wanted to do with your life? I mean, who is Ken growing up? You had to have had a humbling moment, because it sounds like you really just kind of sit back and the world is just going well around you. But what was your why when you were younger? And did you have any humbling moments to become this person you are today?
I don't know the answer to that. I always had a curiosity about other cultures because of my parents, who were immigrants from the former Yugoslavia. So I grew up exposed to languages, cultures, history. I had traveled some as a youngster, and as a 14-year-old, and again as a 17-year-old, I hitchhiked across much of the former Yugoslavia by myself, and I spoke the languages, so I felt comfortable enough doing that. My poor parents must have worried themselves.
I'm just thinking of it.
This is before cell phones and internet, and I slept in parks sometimes in a hostel. I was very adventuresome. I was also a climber and mountaineer as a youngster. So those things probably shape part of who I am. But the humbling experiences are being a physician, because when you're a medical student, resident, and physician, not all your patients get well. In spite of all the knowledge you have, all the best efforts you do to help them, you lose patients, or you deal with the immense burden of human suffering where the patient may not die, but every time you see them, you see their unbelievable suffering and their courage, and you wonder, how do they make through the day? I saw a patient last month that had been bedridden for a year. I mean, this is like something out of The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, the great novella. I mean, it's like the stuff of a novel, and that keeps you humble. That's probably the most important thing I've done in my career, to always keep other parts of one's ego in check, is being a physician and being with real patients. Because in the other work that I do, be it forensic work that I've done in the past or my current work where I do leadership analysis, that gives you a framework and a reference that's part of who you are.
You hit a few things there I'd love to really emphasize. One, your sense of exploration and curiosity took you outside. It took you out to engage the world. It just made me remember, I read former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis's book this past year on Call Sign Chaos, and he hitchhiked across the United States when he was younger, drove his parents probably nuts, and look what he wound up doing with his life because of his curiosity. You got to get outside and just experience life, and that creates that humility, I think. You're going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, to learn, you need to get out of your comfort zone. And I always, in the earlier part of my career as a clinician, I worked in tougher places, if you will, more challenging places like large county psychiatric emergency rooms or jails. Most people don't want to work in those settings. They're dangerous, they're gritty, they're nasty. But that helped me learn a lot. The patients are sicker, there's more violence. And violence is a scary thing in those settings. It's very real and it's very scary. I'll never forget when I worked in the jail, the first time I rode in an elevator with 40 inmates. I was the only non-inmate in the elevator, riding to the medical floor. And they're like, "Morning, doc, morning, doc, morning, doc." And in that world, if you show fear or any wrong emotion, you're going to be victimized. You're going to be injured or killed very quickly. There's a camera in the elevator, but they won't be able to get to you fast enough.
Right.
So you have to just be who you are. Yeah. And so I think I learned to control fear in those settings and just do my job and focus on whatever my mission was, whether it's clinical or later diplomatic. And my favorite postings in the diplomatic world were the more challenging, grittier settings like Russia, Mexico, South Asia. That's where you stretch your boundaries more. And I think that's what Jack and Dan were talking about in one of your earlier podcasts.
Yeah, your level of empathy seeds from you. That curiosity makes you incredibly empathetic with understanding others from their point of view and their optic. And I think it gives you your context, which makes you exceptionally phenomenal interviewer like you are. How do you maintain yourself? I mean, how do you not go overboard and feeling too much empathy so you go into a fit of depression? Because you are seeing the most challenging side human beings see and deal with in life. How do you maintain it for yourself?
I'm blessed with a loving family. That helps. I've always been an athlete, someone that likes to work out, martial arts, and going to the gym and kind of finding a balance there. Spending time with my family is very important to me. My faith, my religious faith is very important. And these are anchors for me, friends and family. I'm blessed with very deep friendships over the years, both in my previous life, but also in the diplomatic world, people that I've met that are very dear friends, a lot of shared experiences that drew us together. So I think those different things help one find a balance. And it's not easy. These are hard times we live in. The pandemic has been very hard on people all over the world. In this country, over 1 million have died. I've been lucky that, I've had one relative that had an elderly relative that had 2 sisters die in the last year. But, touch wood, been lucky. But I've had patients that I've cared for. I saw a patient last year who called me on a video conference who said, "I need to see you this afternoon." And I fortunately had a slot. And the patient's, I think, sibling had died an hour before. So with telemedicine, we were fortunate. The patient was too distraught to drive to the office, but we were able to have a talk, and I was able to provide the medical support that this person needed. So these are hard times for people. So I think finding a balance and tapping into that balance is important for people who are interviewing people in difficult professions.
And I think you highlighted some of the greatest tools people can do for themselves. They're not complex, but they do take effort. One, you move. Movement is one of the greatest things we do for our psychological health, I think. And you're of service to others, which is another thing that you do for our own comfort. And sounds like you have great, healthy, strong relationships. You have the trifecta of stuff that maintains that great inner peace and calm in order to do these challenging things. Would you agree?
Yeah, I try my best. As they say, there's a word called self-care a lot, but self-care is really care of the self.
Absolutely. You said something in our pre-interview, and that is humanize people who are difficult to humanize. And basically nothing which is human is alien to me. What do you mean by that?
That's a saying from a famous Roman philosopher, but you have to try to find humanity in everybody. It's not easy. I'll be the first to admit it. When I worked in the jail or worked as a forensic expert interviewing people, I had to interview capital murderers who for a trial, who were charged with the most heinous, vicious crimes, and it was life and death. They're facing the death penalty in Texas. And you had to look at different circumstances, what the legal system calls aggravating circumstances, which can include their personality, any social or psychopathic personalities, and their prior acts of violence and who they are. But you had to look at the human side, which was this person didn't grow up this way. So you'd go back and look at what was their childhood like, what were formative experiences for them. And you had to shut off your own personal emotions and biases as best as you can. And nobody's perfect at that. It's very hard to do. But you had to be in the room with that person and get them to talk to you. I had a very fascinating experience once where I interviewed a young murderer who, no prior history, a young woman who had murdered and, frankly, without going into further detail, butchered her child. And I spent about 8 hours with this defendant who was in the jail for, I think, before trial for about 2 years. And I had interviewed her, and many other experts had interviewed her for possible insanity at the time of offense, meaning she would go off to a state hospital for many years instead of prison. And I sent my report to the court, to the defense attorney who had given me permission. I always check with the defense attorney, even though I had a court order. Do I have permission to interview your client? I was hired by the state, by the prosecutor. And what happened was really interesting. I didn't hear anything more about it. And these things take a long time sometimes. And one day I was at work in the jail in Fort Worth, and I get a phone call from the prosecutor saying, "We need you in court in Dallas now." I'm like, "What? The case, you didn't give me any heads up?" They said, "Well, there's a plea bargain agreement, but we want you there." I said, "Why do I need to be there? Everyone signs the paper, go forward." And they said, "The defendant refuses to sign it unless you're there." I said, "This is insane. She has her own expert witness, the defense expert psychiatrist, who actually was one of my teachers and is a real expert." I said, "Get him to be there with her." She goes, "She wants you." I said, "Okay, give me an hour. I got to go home, put a suit on, and then drive over to the courthouse." So I did that. I get there, and we're in a little holding area outside the courtroom, a holding cell, they call them. The defendant is there with her lawyer. The DA was there. The defense expert was there, and I was there. And I said, "You have a plea bargain. You've discussed it with your attorney, correct?" The attorney said, "Correct." It was for a sentence in prison rather than an indeterminate possible insanity type of sentence. And the risk to the defendant was a 99-year was the maximum sentence. So the defendant is serious legal risk for the defendant, even though it was a first offense. And there was a courtroom ready to start trial if the defendant refused to sign. Packed. Reporters, media, everyone was there. The courtroom was packed. And so you can feel the emotional tension in that little cell and in the air. And I asked her, "Are you comfortable signing the agreement?" I asked, "Do I have permission to ask her a question?" The attorney said yes. And she looked at me and said, "I'm scared." I said, "What are you scared of?" And I said, "Why did you call me?" She said, "Because I trust you." I said, I'm the state's expert. I may be called to testify in my report, even though I thought that she met the criteria of insanity. There were things that were damaging still to her in that report. And I told her, she knew that. I said, "I may be forced to say things that could hurt you and put you in prison." She goes, "I still trust you." I said, she goes, "I want to know, will I get medical care?" Because she had improved with medical care in the jail when I go to prison. I said, "My colleague, the doctor standing next to me, who also worked in the jail, and I will, and the attorneys will make sure that your medical packet goes with you and that you get a proper medical intake so that you can continue your treatment should you choose to accept the plea bargain and go to prison." She said, "I'll sign the paper." She signed the paper. I walked out and went back to my regular work. So that was a striking example of how you forge trust in the most unusual circumstance where it's not set up for trust. I was the opposing expert whose testimony could potentially harm her and help put her in prison for 99 years. But she trusted me. I'll never understand why. She did most of her sentence, got released, and I don't know what happened to this young person.
I'm going to venture a guess because you have that non-judgmental curiosity, which leads me into that question because we're coming towards the end. I want to kind of get some little more tools here for folks to take away from. And that is, so how, and this is an example of it, I believe, how is it you inspire someone to tell you the truth and or share something with you that might not be in their best interests? How do you start that process with them?
You have to show empathy and curiosity about them and let them tell their story. Most people will want to tell you their story. And I found that when I was a forensic interviewer, you don't follow a linear script. You often go non-linear. I had one defendant where he had tattoos, the teardrop tattoos and that, and other tattoos. So I asked about his tattoos. I said, before we get started, I'm just kind of curious. I don't know anything, but can you explain your tattoos? They're kind of interesting to me and what they mean to you. And he told me about all his tattoos. This one's about my homie. This one's about someone I shot. This one here on my arm. This is my girlfriend. So he opened up. He told me I showed a curiosity about just who he is as a person. Right. And then he opened up and I said, well, as you know, we're here not just to talk about tattoos, but about other things. And then I said, I'm here and I've been hired by so-and-so and this is the purpose. Do you want to continue? He said, sure. I spoke 5 hours with him.
Have you ever failed?
Yeah, sadly. I've failed. If I've failed as a psychiatrist, there are two places where I failed. One is where I've lost a patient to suicide. Fortunately, very few, 2 in my career. But I consider those painful failures.
Oh my gosh.
Even though I went back, these type of things get reviewed, but no, 3 patients to suicide, but I consider them tragic. And in a sense, you always have a sense of personal failure that somehow you might have missed something unconsciously or consciously that could help the person want to live. And during the height of the pandemic, I felt I had failed when I couldn't persuade with all of my best persuasion skills and scientific knowledge and all that. Many of my patients, I had to respect their decision not to get the COVID vaccine. And that's their choice. Fortunately, none of my patients have died from COVID who didn't get the vaccine. But it with 1 million people dead in this country, that was always a worry. So I consider the inability to persuade them. You have to know who the drivers are in people's lives, who influence them. I had one patient who refused the vaccine, then came back a few months later and said, I got the vaccine. And I thought, oh, great. With all my skills, I finally persuaded the person. I said, what made you get the vaccine? They said, oh, my husband got it. So then I figured I'd get it too.
Hey, it doesn't matter how you win as long as it's a win.
Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you.
That's awesome. Ken, I'm curious. So one of my favorite questions always, because I've had these humbling moments in my life and I wish I could go back in time and tell my 20-year-old self a little bit of advice. What advice do you have for your 20-year-old self all those years ago that you now know that you didn't know back then that would have helped you?
I've been very blessed with my life and work experiences, and I'm very blessed to be a physician, and I was very blessed to be a diplomat. I would probably seek out, as adventuresome as I would seek out other adventuresome things to stretch my abilities. And I would have tried to improve in the things that I'm good at, but I would have probably done 1 or 2 other things and other types of service that, later life, I was inspired, for example, by people I knew in the military and in law enforcement. I probably would have sought out those kind of things earlier in my life. I came to public service as a diplomat later in my life, in my 40s. But otherwise, you can't go back. So I have no regrets, and I'm grateful for the experiences I've had to do what I do to help folks, and as a diplomat to serve the greatest nation in the world.
Ken, there's no doubt I understand why you're effective, because I could sit here and talk to you for hours. You're
That's
soothing,
so kind of you.
You're curious, your tenor, your intonation, your modulation, your nonverbals. I mean, you are the full package of awesome interviewer. And I want to thank you for sharing your time, your expertise. I'm hoping everyone took out their pens and papers and took a few extra notes along the way. And with that, Ken, thank you again for taking the time today.
Thank you so much, Robin, for having me, and I appreciate your listeners tuning into your show. I've found your show to be of great value.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Forged by Trust podcast. If you enjoyed the show, took away a few new tools, I hope you will leave a great review of the show to show your support. If you're interested in more information about how to forge your own trust building strategies, please visit my website and resources at www.peopleformula.com. I'm looking forward to sharing my next Forged by Trust episode with you next week when we chat with my friend Dr. Diane Hamilton about the power of curiosity.